Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S MindLab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wonder why some people struggle to string words together after a stroke, producing jumbled sentences? Well, this new study dives deep into how our brains build sentences and what happens when that process breaks down. Today, we're exploring a fascinating study that uses a really cool idea called a Multinomial Processing Tree model to understand how we put sentences together, and more importantly, why sometimes that goes wrong, especially in people with aphasia. Imagine building a sentence like constructing a house. You first need a blueprint, right? That is like the basic idea or message you want to convey. Then you build the frame and walls of the house. For sentences, this is like figuring out the core structure, who did what to whom. After the structure is up, you add the details like paint, doors, and windows to make it ready for people to use. That is like turning that abstract structure into a spoken or written sentence. Scientists have long thought about sentence production in these two main steps. First, you create a kind of mental blueprint, an unordered hierarchical structure. Think of it as the skeleton of the sentence, showing the relationships between words. The second step is linearization, where you take that skeleton and turn it into a smooth, linear sequence of words that we can actually say or write. This idea of a two-stage process has been around for a while, but it has been hard to put it to a real test in a way that gives us hard numbers or shows us where in the brain each part happens. That's where this new research comes in. The researchers developed a new computational tool, a multinomial processing tree model, to finally put this two-stage idea into a testable form. They wanted to see if they could measure how well someone is doing at each of these two stages, building the structure and then linearizing it. They focused their study on people with aphasia, which is a language disorder that can happen after a stroke. By looking at the kinds of errors these individuals make when they speak, the researchers hope to pinpoint where in the sentence-building process things are going wrong. You know how sometimes people describe aphasia by saying someone's speech is like a telegram? That's often called Agrammatism. It means a lot of the small words like the a or verb endings are missing, making the speech sound choppy. On the other hand, there is another type of error called paragrammatism, where people might substitute words or add them in ways that don't quite fit, often resulting in sentences that sound a bit wild or sentence monsters. The really neat part is how these error patterns seem to connect directly to the two stages of sentence building. The researchers propose that those telegraphic agrammatic errors, where small words or endings are missing, are likely happening at the linearization stage. If you can't properly arrange the sentence onto a spoken track, you might leave out those functional bits. But the paragrammatic errors, the substitutions and structural oddities seem to happen earlier at the hierarchical stage, where the underlying structure of the sentence is being built. If that blueprint is faulty, the whole sentence can get messed up in more complex ways. So the big question was, can we use this error data to measure each person's ability at each stage? And can we see where in the brain these different abilities are located? To do this, they collected spoken stories from people with aphasia. Think of them retelling the story of Cinderella. They then carefully coded each sentence for different types of errors. They categorized sentences as either grammatical, meaning they were perfectly fine. Then they had hierarchical processing errors. These were sentences with structural problems, like wrong word order that wasn't just missing a small word or inserting words where they didn't belong. These were thought to point to problems in the first stage, building the structure. They also coded for linearization processing errors. These were sentences missing multiple small words or endings. This pointed to a problem in the second stage, turning the structure into a smooth spoken sentence. There were also mixed errors, where you saw signs of both types of problems. And finally, omission errors. These were sentences with just one missing functional word, and it was tricky to tell if it was a hierarchical or linearization problem. Now, here is where the fancy math comes in. They used their multinomial processing tree model. Imagine a tree where each branch represents a step in processing. At the top, you have the intent to speak. The first branch is whether you successfully build the sentence's blueprint, the hierarchical structure. If you succeed, you move on to the next branch. Can you correctly turn that structure into a spoken sequence linearization? If you succeed at both, you get a grammatical sentence. If you fail at the first step, you might get a hierarchical error. If you succeed there but fail at the second, you might get a linearization error. They also built in a way to account for omission errors and mixed errors. They fitted this model to the error data from each person with aphasia. This process gives them not just a list of errors, but actual numbers representing each person's estimated ability at each stage. So they got a number for their hierarchical building ability. Let's call it A. A number for their linearization ability. Let's call it B. and another number, let's call it C, that basically captures the likelihood that an error will show up as a simple omission. The really exciting part was using this data to look at the brain. They had MRI scans of the participants' brains and knew where they had any damage from strokes. Then, they did what's called lesion parameter mapping. They essentially asked for each of those ability numbers A, B, and C, what brain areas, when damaged, are associated with a lower ability score. And their findings were pretty remarkable. They found that the ability to build the hierarchical structure that a score was linked to areas in the middle temporal gyrus and the posterior part of the parietal lobe, like the angular gyrus. This makes sense because these areas are known to be involved in processing complex relationships and information. Then they looked at the linearization ability, that B score. This was associated with damage in the frontal parts of the brain, specifically the middle frontal gyrus and the inferior frontal sulcus. These areas are often linked to planning and sequencing, which is exactly what turning an abstract structure into a spoken sequence requires. And the probability of errors showing up as omissions, that C score, was linked to damage in the superior frontal sulcus and the white matter pathways connecting to it. This suggests that certain brain areas might be more involved in determining how errors manifest. It is important to note that they compared their model to a simpler one, and the simpler one actually fit the data a little better in terms of raw numbers. But the researchers argue that the MPT model is more valuable because its parameters have real-world meanings tied to the specific stages of sentence production. Knowing someone has trouble with hierarchical building low A is much more informative than just knowing they have a certain rate of hierarchical errors. So, what does this all mean? This study is a big step because it is the first time a two-stage model of sentence production has been put into a formal computational framework that can be tested and applied to real data. It takes the abstract ideas about how we build sentences and turns them into something measurable. This means we can now get specific numbers for how well someone is doing at each stage of sentence building, not just categorize their errors. This could be incredibly useful for understanding aphasia. Doctors and therapists could get a clearer picture of where a patient's specific difficulties lie, allowing for more targeted and effective treatment. It also helps us understand the brain mechanisms underlying language in general. And perhaps most importantly, the fact that the ability scores from their model lined up so well with brain damage in specific areas provides strong evidence that these two stages, building the structure and then linearizing it, are handled by different, separable parts of the brain. We have a neural split for these two crucial steps in putting sentences together. Now, every study has its limits, right? This research was done using stories from a specific task, and it might not apply to all kinds of talking also. Sometimes it is really hard for people to agree on exactly what kind of error a sentence has, especially those complex hierarchical errors. This means there might be a bit of noise in the data they used. Future research might involve looking at even more data, perhaps with more refined ways of coding errors, or exploring even more complex models of how our minds put words together. Overall, this study gives us a powerful new way to understand the intricate process of building sentences, both in healthy brains and when things go awry after injury. It bridges theoretical linguistics, computational modeling, and neuroscience to give us a deeper insight into the architecture of human language. It's a fantastic example of how breaking down a complex problem into stages and then using data to test those stages can lead to profound discoveries about our minds and brains. If you found this as fascinating as I did, be sure to give this video a thumbs up. Let me know in the comments what other complex scientific topics you'd like us to break down. And don't forget to subscribe to RUBIN'S MindLab for more deep dives into the cutting edge of human psychology and neuroscience. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.